Allow the sensation of your breathing to come to your attention. You immediately become aware of the sensation, yes? Now, did that sensation begin the moment I drew your attention to it? Or were you always aware of it, but as it were, not aware that you were aware of it because you were focusing your attention exclusively on other matters?
I mean, I think I would have to consult memory. I'm not quite sure, honestly. I don't really know how to answer that.
Okay. Okay. Well, let me suggest that you were aware of the sensation of breathing, but because that sensation is so subtle, and there are so many other more pressing sensations or perceptions to attend to, that you didn't notice the sensation of breathing. In other words, the sensation of breathing was being experienced, but it was excluded from the foreground of your experience due to the focusing of your attention. Now, I would suggest, following this line, that everything that is currently being experienced by anyone, any of the 7 billion of us, and by all animals, that is any of the 7 trillion of us, is being experienced by the same consciousness. However, as we said before, in order to experience anything, consciousness must narrow itself, constrict itself, limit itself to a single mind. But consciousness, I would suggest, has the ability to contract into numerous finite minds at the same time. And each of the 7 trillion finite minds that are currently experiencing something are simultaneous contractions or localizations of the same infinite consciousness. But just as when our finite mind focuses on a particular object, other objects recede into the background or the periphery of its awareness, like the sensation of your breathing, and seem no longer to be experienced. I would suggest that each localization of consciousness excludes from the experience of that particular mind everything that is being experienced by consciousness in all other minds. And that is why each of our minds only experiences its own particular content. But this does not deny the fact that another mind made of the same consciousness may not be experiencing what we call the streets of New York. Now, you may say that to suggest that contradicts my starting point that experience must be the test of reality. You may, and quite reasonably, say, well, you are assuming that New York is being experienced by another mind. You cannot verify that. It's an assumption. It's not your experience, and you are absolutely right. So the question is it legitimate to make such an assumption? And I would suggest yes, it is. Each of our finite minds is finite, limited. Therefore, no finite mind can legitimately say only the content of my experience exists, because it is limited. It is not in a position to say that. It has to be open to the possibility that there may be other finite minds like itself. And that is not too unreasonable to assume that there may be other finite minds like my finite mind. It's more of the same. The question is, what is it not reasonable to assume? is it reasonable to assume, for instance, that there is something called matter that exists outside consciousness? Would such an assumption be another example of a duplication of what we already experience? And the answer is no. There is no valid basis for assuming that there is something called matter outside consciousness, because nobody has ever experienced it. So to make such an assumption is to assume a completely new category of experience that nobody has ever or could ever verify. Whereas to assume the existence of a finite mind other than my own is simply to assume that there are more minds that we do already experience. It is a category of experience that is already experienced. So it is not such a big leap to assume there may be more finite minds than my own, as it is to assume there is something called matter outside consciousness. They are two completely different kinds of assumption. One is based on our experience and the other is not.